It's a pleasure for me to be here with three amazing speakers today at an event organized by the Center for Media, Data and Society. We are a research outfit based in Budapest, belonging to the Central European University Democracy Institute. It's great to discuss this issue. We have an event talking about banning Trump on social media, freedom of expression in the era of platform power. A topic that has been on the agenda for many years, but it is becoming more and more important for everybody's lives. It is a key topic in policy discussions, in political fora, and almost everywhere. So what we want to do today is try to discuss the various approaches to the power of platforms, to how they should be regulated, whether they should be regulated, and if that is the case, I think a key and very important question is who. As I said, I have three wonderful speakers today with us. Kate Coyer is a fellow at our center and an affiliate of the Bergman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Kate has been working for a long time on these issues. She has examined in her work the use of new and old technologies for social change and the impact on human rights. But she also did a lot of work on social media policy and practice, among many, many other issues. We also have today Eliška Pírková. Eliška works as Europe Policy Analyst at Access Now, which is an international civil society organization that defends and extends digital rights of online users at risk. Eliška is leading the organization's European work on content governance issues, including the EU Digital Services Act package. This is, I think, the latest, right? The latest piece of legislation in the field that the EU is dealing with these days. Since 2021, I mean, since this year, right? You are the global content governance lead, coordinating Access Now global agenda on freedom of expression online. Also we have today with us Courtney Radsch. She's a fellow at our center as well. She has been working as a journalist, researcher, and free expression advocate. And she wrote a lot and she spoke a lot, very frequently, about issues that are at the intersection of media, technology, and human rights. She is, among other things, the author of Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism in Egypt, Digital Dissidence and Political Change, which is a great book published back 5 years ago, right, already in 2016, but also many other book chapters and articles about the Arab Spring, media, terrorism, and human rights. She also consulted various international organizations, including UNESCO, OSCE, and the EU, on topics such as countering violent extremism, online violence against women, and journalist safety. So welcome, first of all. Thank you very much for making time for this discussion. And first, just a very quick question for all of you, because not long ago, I think a week or so ago, we were all probably in the same rooms or living rooms watching television and watching the riots. And I think at least it happened in my family. Everybody was asking at some point when we saw the anchors quoting Trump from Twitter. People around me ask, why don't they stop him? Why don't they ban him? And eventually it happened. But then when it happened, I started to really think, is it okay to actually ban content online? Yes, that's a big question. And now I'm posing that question to you, and I want to see what you think. But also, if you agree or you don't agree, what do you think is the limit for blocking people from expressing themselves online? Why don't we start with you, Courtney?
Great. Well, thanks so much. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. I'm delighted to be part of it. So I think that what happened with the kind of backlash in the wake of the insurrection at the US Capitol, which is just down the street where I am right now in Washington, DC, there are a few different dimensions. So first off, we saw that President Trump was banned from Twitter and several other platforms. We actually saw a lot of other kind of permutations of types of blocking. We saw his website where merchandise for the campaign is sold was taken offline. Payment processors no longer willing to do that service. We saw also that other alternative social media platforms that had arisen to provide space to people whose content was getting blocked or taken down, or accounts taken down on the mainstream media platforms, creating their own platforms or going to alternative platforms where that speech was seen to be allowed. But then what we saw happen was that some of those platforms like Parler or Parlay, however you want to say it, were also denied access to kind of mainstream platforms for cloud computing, for DNS, domain name service, web hosting. So I think we want to unpack and talk about kind of, if we think about regulation and how we should think about this, look at different sections of this. So let's think about Trump and his ban separately from how we think about what the reaction was to non-presidential people on social media platforms. And then let's also think about what happened at what, like, different layers of the tech stack. So when we talk about, you know, kind of this content moderation, we're usually talking about the top level applications, social media platforms that are looking at content. Usually we're not thinking about the pipes that bring us that information or the domain name hosting systems, but there is precedence back in 2018 when GoDaddy and other Cloudflare, which is a kind of a content delivery network and a cybersecurity provider, refused to provide services to right-wing extremist websites like the Daily Stormer, InfoWars, 8chan. So I think we need to talk about those things separately. And when we think about, okay, Trump, should Trump be banned from Twitter? Should that decision be up to an individual platform? And I would note that, you know, Chancellor Merkel in Germany has come out against that. We've seen President Obrador in Mexico say, you know, that we're going to create a campaign against this. Poland is going to look at a new law to prohibit this. Well, you know, if you are president or prime minister or chancellor, you have a built-in megaphone and you are inherently newsworthy. So the fact that one platform won't carry your speech seems to me far less concerning, because if, for example, Trump or Merkel decided to go to Discord or, you know, Gab or whatever, the media would go there because that is where they are speaking. They also have the ability to hold press conferences, daily press briefings, send out press releases with all of the the mechanics of government there. So I am actually far less concerned that world leaders could be denied a platform to communicate, you know, so-called directly with people, because they already have that. And these platforms are inherently manipulatable. And if we look at the expansion of information warfare and what the Oxford Internet Institute calls computational propaganda, what we're seeing is that, in fact, world leaders and governments are using these platforms to manipulate public opinion, information, and I think we want to think about how could we combat that. Now, if we think about Parler as an alternative social media source and an alternative to the dominance of the major platforms, you know, that could raise some concerns, because we hear from regulators, oh, well, there's not enough competition. You know, we need alternatives. This was an alternative, but, you know, is it not okay for the private sector to shun products that don't adhere to basic, you know, human rights or social values? And I wrote about this in my personal blog, you know, thinking about the marketplace of ideas and, you know, a grocery store. So if you want to change, you know, Nike's sweatshop practices, then, you know, maybe banning their shoes until they stop using child labor would have been effective, or you want to, you know, get more humane meat or whatever. So I think we really need to think about parallels. We need to see who, when we're talking about a speaker, what level of power and access do they already have? And, you know, I'm sorry, I can't remember the author right now, but I read an article that was comparing kind of the left-wing extremists and kind of the left-wing who have been denied access to mainstream media, as well as mainstream media social media platforms, they went off and created, pirate radio. They've created their own, you can get online without access to mainstream, and we can't look at the online information environment outside of the broader media and information ecosystem. I'll leave it there because I know.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Yes, that's great. Thank you. Well, you opened a lot of questions here, in fact. But let me just go to Eliška. Eliška, do you agree with Trump's ban? And if yes, why? If no, why?
Good evening from Brussels. And first of all, thank you very much for having me tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here in such a great company. So before I will actually answer your question, because that's quite a black and white one, and there are many complex issues to consider. But I would also go back a little bit to the point that Courtney has already raised, and just to maybe mention the term that was actually picked up by media and also by some other stakeholder in the space, and that was deplatforming of Trump. And precisely, we actually, as an organization, we have a lot against that term of deplatforming, due to the fact that it's quite difficult to actually remove a platform from the head of state, who already has enough platform and enough space to actually let his expressions and ideas to be heard. And at the same time, with that goes also a responsibility that such a public figure holds in their hands. We think that this is a quite inaccurate term that can potentially cause a lot of damage in the future if it gets picked up by legislators or policymakers. And we saw that before, this sort of inaccuracy finding its way into different policy instruments. And to this day, and I think many will agree with me, we are fighting against terms such as fake news or child pornography, which still isn't eliminated from media and other sources. And these are all inaccurate terms that can actually eventually impose a lot of damage. This is just a side comment. But going back to your question, I think that the imperative issue here is that Trump's accounts were temporarily banned by private actors. And if we look at it from the perspective of human rights law and from, let's say, European approach to freedom of expression as such is not an absolute right. And there are, as everyone knows, legitimate restrictions that can be imposed if those legitimate grounds are being met. But who normally or should actually decide on whether the freedom of expression will be restricted are states. It belongs to the positive obligation to state to actually protect individuals' human rights and to also exercise the balancing of rights. In this case, we are in a situation where dominant platforms will take a decision which, in opinion of many, was a long time overdue, since we need to realize that amplification of disinformation or potentially harmful content did not start with storming the US Capitol and with Trump's statements. This is a long-term issue that is directly connected to the business models of this online platform. And when they are eventually actually pushed by government and public pressure to do something, especially in those democratic systems where digital rights are already treated as a priority and there are policies and legislative efforts in place, then of course they go and take those actions. But if we compare that to other parts of the world where they also have equally dominant positions, such as the global south, for instance, we saw very different responses from these platforms in cases where there were severe human rights violations happening and where the spread of incitement to hatred and violence was a regular occurrence. We saw a deep negligence on the side of these platforms, such as not even having enough moderators that could adequately assess the linguistic, cultural, and historical context of that particular country, and so on. So I think that this is the starting point. And also we need to actually pay enough attention to the argument that I often keep mentioning as well as my colleagues, and that's the way how these platforms, and concretely dominant platforms, or some of them call them online gatekeepers, ultimately actually benefit from amplification of sensational and potentially harmful content, such as disinformation and other forms of these particular categories of content. That's of course connected again to data harvesting business models, to attention economy, and to serious power asymmetries between online users or individuals that use these platforms and these private actors. Now, of course, within the European tradition as well, political speech as such deserves extra or quite high level of protection. But we saw on regular basis that different European states did not hesitate and didn't hold back to restrict even the speech of public figures and politicians that potentially or was actually assessed at the end as incitement to hatred or violence against vulnerable groups. The famous example could be the case from 2010, Jean-Marie Le Pen, which eventually found its way to the European Court of Human Rights and belongs to one of those precedential cases, but it's far from the only one. But I think, and that will be my final point, this is the issue that actually prevails here when online platforms replace the state and becomes quasi-judicial bodies in this space. They do so with no public scrutiny. There are still no requirements for meaningful transparency, where transparency reporting would be actually a legal obligation to them. And this is not to say that the regulation is the only right response. I think we need to look at it quite holistically, where self-regulation, state regulation, and to some extent co-regulation of these giant platforms will play equal share. But there are certainly some actors in this space that actually have the power to create and to shape a global approach to speech regulation and to way how free expression will be regulated in online space, which we already see in practice. And at the same time, these same platforms apply these standards in a very diverse way in different parts of the world. I'll stop there and I'll wait for your question and the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eliška. This is really this is great, and I'm really glad that you opened the issue of regulation. We'll get back to that in a moment, but let me just go to Kate. But before asking Kate, I think you mentioned the right to public speech and the political speech and all the rest. But with Trump, I think, at least that's how I view it, it was another issue. It was an issue of instigating to violence, which I'm not sure where we put. I think that was the key argument for banning him. But Kate, what do you think?
Actually, that's a point I'm going to pick up on. I'm glad you brought it up, and thank you all. It's really a pleasure and to be with you all to talk about this. And I think one thing that cuts through what a lot of us are saying is that we need to be very clear about a fundamental point, which is that social media companies have too much power, that no private company should have the kind of power that they do to filter, to moderate, to gatekeep our access, our information, our data, our communication, right? I mean, Facebook is not a nice company, and could argue that it should be destroyed, and Google broken apart, and Twitter turned into a public interest platform. But in the meantime, I think we are in this kind of what's tantamount to an abusive relationship with the platforms in this way. And a lot of us that have been doing digital rights work for a long time see this, and we've been working with and trying to find these ways through with the companies. And so I do fundamentally believe that we need regulation to really rein in their entire business model and protect data and privacy. So, in a way, I'll kind of give a slow clap to Twitter and Facebook for finally doing something with only 2 weeks or less of Trump's presidency. So it's kind of swell to know that armed insurrection and acts of white nationalist terrorism are actually the lines that can't be crossed. So I guess if I'm putting my main points in this opening statement opening comments into 3 points. To Marius, to your question, I support the decision, right? And certainly with reservations, it's not an easy decision, and it's complicated, as I think Courtney and Eliška have really well pointed out. And to that point that Marius, you just said, it's, we need to drive home the point that we're not just talking about speech, but we're talking about speech that incites violence, and that's not protected speech. And so I do worry that in some of the conversations, not here, but in other places, that there's a lot of false equivalencies. And that the ways in which the right have been co-opting the whole kind of free speech debate is something we could also talking about, and using censorship as both a badge of honor and a rallying cry. And I think it's also telling that, it's not necessarily any single tweet from Trump. I personally think the things that were removed weren't necessarily the worst things that he's ever said online, or the most egregious, the most, untrue, harmful, and even insightful. Which kind of brings me to my second point, and I think it's something Courtney was also touching on, which is that, Twitter's argument has long been that it was important to keep up the tweets from high-profile political figures like Donald Trump, like Bolsonaro, to heads of state with a darker, former heads of state, for one, with a dark and dangerous history of tweets. And their argument was that what world leaders say is newsworthy or of the public interest, and that exempts them from the kind of community rules that the rest of us are subject to. And, there is a layer where that argument makes sense on the surface, but I actually think they got it backwards this whole time. And so to what Courtney was saying earlier, that, Donald Trump lost access to Twitter, but had access to arguably the largest bully pulpit in the world. And the fact that he chose not to use it, instead kind of, sulk and fume inside a demoralized and chaotic White House, that's a choice. We don't have access to that kind of speech platform. And I am also, far more concerned with the rights of individuals that don't have, Tucker Carlson on speed dial, and what their free expression and speech and access concerns. And I think something that's useful in this that I keep going back to and thinking about it is the UN's Rabat Plan of Action on hate speech and the 6 criteria that they've kind of set out for whether speech is risable to the level of hate speech. And again, we're not even talking about hate speech in a First Amendment US context. We're talking about incitement to violence, but it's still worth looking at. And, the criteria includes things like context, the position of speaker, the intent, and the likelihood and immediacy of action as a result of the speech. So I would say that even under the context of international human rights law, which I'm not an expert in, but it certainly feels like that's helpful in framing this question and thinking through, why the exception for world leaders should probably be the other way around. And we should be more concerned again about protecting the rights of individuals, other individuals. And then I guess the third main point I wanted to say is that, especially that we can't lose, I don't want us to lose sight of how, at the root of a lot of this is the concentration of media ownership that has decimated quality local journalism. And we have expectations, not just in the US, in Europe and other places, that the government can and should do something to intervene on behalf of media diversity, on plurality, on localism, on all these kind of things in the analog world. Yet there's been this reluctancy to take action, in the digital world. And the US Supreme Court currently has the case in front of them with this very question, Prometheus Radio Project versus the FCC, which is about it's about concentration of media ownership and to do with broadcast and print publications and how much control mechanisms should be in place. Companies like Sinclair Broadcasting, which requires local stations to run nationally produced news segments that, for example, routinely equate Muslims with terrorism, now reach 40% of American households. So that is deeply concerning. And, we don't know what the outcome of this court case is going to be, but these are things that are massive problems that aren't necessarily getting the attention that, that Twitter's ban on Trump does, and is arguably as dangerous. And so, surrendering our public square to a few broadcast corporations kind of brought us exactly to this moment in a lot of ways. And I think there's a lot we can learn from and think about, even some, media regulation and broadcasting regulation, and how that might be applied to social media platforms. And I guess just in conclusion, I'd throw out that for those of us that have been studying extremism online, and Courtney's written about this, and as well, that, when Twitter took down massive amounts of content from the Islamic State, it was under pressure from the US State Department, from the EU, and from others. And many of us argued at the time, that this was problematic because, for a lot of reasons, but not just on the grounds of whether or not that content, we can have a discussion on whether that content should or shouldn't be up there, but that the content rules were being applied unevenly, and they were being applied to one form of extremism because of governmental pressure. And I think this connects with some of the points Eliška was making as well. But they weren't being applied to content on the far right, to neo-Nazis, to white supremacist extremism. So even if we argue, and as we debate what the term should be and what kind of regulation should be, I think one particular scope for regulation is also, the application of these kind of rules are evenly and not arbitrarily in response to state pressure. So I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, this is a lot to go through, but I already have a few really important points that I want to get back to. One is the issue of regulation. The second is a key element of regulation is who is actually in charge, who is going to make the decision. I think that's going to be a big discussion at the EU level and everywhere. But there is also the issue of journalism and what role it plays in staving off misinformation and also other ills on social media. But let me just start with the issue of regulation. You all spoke about the need of regulation, self-regulation, but now just trying to be more concrete. And now let me just go to something that Kate, you were quoted in the Wired a while ago, saying that you were saying here that we want a free and open internet, and we want a space that we aren't paying a subscription for, but we also don't want to encounter some of the worst elements of humanity on there. And at a certain point, we may have to make a compromise. And I think when we speak about regulation, we speak about compromise a lot. We speak about what is acceptable, where is the limit, if there should be a limit. This is a question for all three of you. If you are to think about regulation, how would you do it if you were asked to design a model of regulation that would solve all these problems? I know it's huge. Good luck with that. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to kick off the discussion. I think to the extent that we can look at regulation as getting kind of as far from the content itself is how this should be approached. So already, I think all of us referred to the business models of several tech platforms. And let's be very clear that, the big five, are, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Gamma, are fundamentally different than, say, Twitter. So Twitter is very influential, and you see that the only platforms that all of these world leaders are talking about, they're not talking about Discord and Reddit and Snapchat. They're talking about Twitter because that's where the influencers are. Everyone has decided to be on this platform, especially journalists who are also amplifiers. So, we should think also about regulation, not as regulating the platforms, but which type of platforms. And again, if we get away from content and we focus on business model, I think that helps because that gets to issue of kind of size, its positioning in the market. So, in some countries, Facebook is essentially the equivalent of the internet in the Philippines, in Myanmar, et cetera. So, is there a different way to think about regulations in those contexts versus other places? Now, the big platforms are not just platforms for speech, but they're literally, the wiring of the internet, the ad tech industry that has grown up because of, Google and Facebook, which also dominate a disproportionate percentage, I think 90% of the digital advertising market. Those are things that can be regulated without really getting into the speech issues. A lot of what happened, again, yes, Trump was tweeting things that were insightful, but those could have easily been conveyed on any other platform. The fact is there had been, this entire ecosystem and groups created. And I think I saw a study that said about 64% or so of those people who were in these extremist groups were referred there by algorithmic recommendations of the platforms. We saw similar things during the uproar around the ISIS recruitment online and the emphasis on kind of online extremism around the recommendation systems, the design of the platforms, which, a journalist named Maria Rappler in the Philippines has really dug into, which is, this idea that they're designed around engagement. Engagement does a lot more, a lot better if you're interested in that topic or feel really, strongly about something. And it's designed for polarization. So, the Friends of Friends design in Facebook is designed for polarization. The recommendation algorithms. There was a study of YouTube recommendation algorithms that looked at how if you started into one topic that has a conspiracy theory linked to it, for example, climate change, you would very quickly get connected with the anti-vaxxers, with QAnon, et cetera. So, there's some great research being done out there that shows that there are these designs of the platforms themselves, the business models, the privacy, the ability to micro-target groups to say, like, I want to reach people who like conspiracy theories and have no friends. Like, why should you be able to do that? So I think there are many things that we can think about where policymakers could regulate that would be far less problematic for speech than saying, this speech category, it should be illegal. And then we should look at self-regulation and normative regulation for speech. So I think, my thinking right now is that it's a good thing that norms are kicking in to say that actually, yeah, it's not okay. Germany has like laws that prohibit Nazism, right? We don't in the United States because of the First Amendment, but I think it's okay for norms to kick in and say, like, actually, we don't want this in the public sphere. We don't want our public sphere dominated by neo-Nazis or terrorists or whatever the issue is. So let that be a self-regulating function where a combination of the private sector, of individuals who, get together and say, we're not going to use this platform if they continue to have this type of content. Like, that seems to me less uncomfortable than having the government come in and say, like, here are categories of speech we don't like, and you need to keep them off the internet. Similarly, I just do want to take issue with something that Eliška and Kate said, because I always think it's interesting when panelists can disagree. Platforms, yes, they govern some of the public sphere and what becomes visible, but they are in no way as powerful as states. States, have the monopoly on the use of violence against their citizens. And the problem is that in some cases, these platforms are actually being weaponized and brought into that the state's use of, in international relations theory, the legitimate use of violence. Well, that's being weaponized against people in their own countries in these online harassment campaigns, these targeting, of individual dissidents or activists or journalists, et cetera. So, I think we can also regulate things like that, like, should there be regulations on how states and political parties and election officials, can use these platforms? Transparency, we can regulate transparency much better. Why only political ad transparency? What's a political ad? Why not transparency on all advertising, on the targeting, et cetera? And of course, the perennial challenge of better access to data of the content that is removed or affected by government regulations or by the implementation of platforms' own terms of service, so that people can better understand what is being affected, what is the error rate, what is the error rate that we're willing to pay to not have terrorists or right-wing extremists online. We haven't had that discussion. And then if they're talking about using algorithms and machine learning to moderate the public sphere, then we need to make sure those are trained well, and we can't do that if we don't have access to the data sets.
Thank you very much, Courtney. So just oversimplifying and summarizing regulation of the power of the platforms is important. On the other hand, when it comes to content and speech, more self-regulation is healthier, and a bigger check on the power of governments, in fact. Eliška, Kate, do you agree?
If we follow the original order, if that's okay for you, Kate, I start, and I feel I have quite a few things to answer here. So before I will actually touch upon the issue of regulation, I just want to emphasize one thing. If you personally ask me whether I agree with the action that incitement to violence and hatred should be removed from the platforms, absolutely, 100%. Incitement to violence and hatred is also recognized as that category of speech under international human rights law that actually allows for last resort measures. In case of state, it's, for instance, that very last measure that usually may may lead to some form of criminalization of speech acts. So just to clarify that. The second point regarding the regulation, and I will use now lots of practical examples from Europe. I absolutely agree on the point, and I'm not exactly sure, Courtney, where we disagree, so maybe it's just a misunderstanding here. So I absolutely agree that when we speak about the regulation, we need to actually focus on the processes. So how actually platforms regulate the content, how they create the rules, and at the same time, the same set of rules have to absolutely apply to states, whether that's the independence of individual regulators, such as media regulators, for instance, that we suffer of quite a lot now in Europe and elsewhere. But also, if we speak about the requirements for meaningful transparency, this shouldn't apply only to platforms, but they should equally actually apply to the state actors, as well as to, for instance, law enforcement, and very unformalized cooperation between law enforcement and platforms, which is something some states in Europe are trying to tackle right now, not always in a fortunate way. And I would also emphasize in relation to states that we witness a lot in recent years here in Europe, how states are trying to backslide on the self-regulation of platforms, how often they try to corner platforms to actually take proactive measures to regulate illegal content. And this happens through different co-regulatory, seemingly voluntary measures that then ultimately lead to overcompliance of platforms. That means big chunks of content, which could be possibly legitimate, will be removed for platforms to escape the risk of intermediary liability. So the conditional model of liability that we have in Europe, which is different than the approach that is currently in states under Section 230. But we don't need to go into it at the moment. But I really want to touch upon the issue of regulation, because right now in Europe, as we already mentioned, on 15th of December, the Digital Services Act package was launched. This is the package that consists of two legislative proposals. One is Digital Services Act, and the second one is Digital Market Act. When we look at the Digital Services Act, and it was said that we should actually address the distinction, what actually makes large online platform or very large online platforms, which is the new term that DSA actually brings to the space, and who are online gatekeepers, which is again a term used by Digital Market Act, and both of them are trying to capture that essence of market dominance on one hand from the competition angle, and also the control over public sphere, which they ultimately exercise, which is also in the core of their business models. So this is something that DSA is trying to achieve. So it has a specific requirements for online platforms in general, and then it has a specific requirements for very large online platforms. And then it's specifically, and it's like a first effort where we see that the legislators are trying to focus on processes. So it has the specific measures on meaningful transparency. It has a set of other specific measures on transparency that concerns only very large online platforms. It tries to regulate online targeting. It goes into open content recommender systems responsible for the personalization of user-generated content. And it also intends to harmonize notice and action procedures without actually defining what is and isn't illegal content, because that's something that still belongs to the discretion of member states. Now, there is so much to say about Digital Services Act, and it definitely has one important thing, which you already raised, Courtney. It actually has a data access framework in it, and that means it's a new form of obligation for platforms to actually disclose data that could enable independent research and better understanding, and finally evidence and research-based policy making that is currently missing. And we are facing a lot of knee-jerk, quickly, swift regulations coming from member states, even after DSA was launched. And the example of Poland was already mentioned. Also, France is currently preparing a new law. We had Austria in autumn 2020 introducing a new law focusing on the regulation of platforms, which can in one way or another weaken the harmonization process within the EU that DSA is trying to achieve. So this data access framework is supposed to, and hopefully will eventually change that, and we will finally achieve that evidence-based policymaking. But these are very early days, so we are still analyzing and going through the law. There is still a consultation running at the European Commission at the moment. So I tend to say about DSA that it's a good start. It's full of good intentions with lots of imperfect perfect solutions at this point. We can definitely do better, but we will have quite a lots of time to work on that legislation. It's only now when it will enter European Parliament. But I just want to make that clear that I absolutely agree, and I don't think there are that many disagreements between us.
Thank you, Eliška. This is I'll go to Kay now, but I have one point that I really think is crucial in the whole discussion, and this is okay, we have DSA and there are many good things there, but I think there is already a lot of debate about who is going to implement that. I think the European Commission, which is the executive arm of the EU, will retain its main regulatory power, but then at local level, national levels, where we have the real problems, where we have oligarchs and autocrats, who's going to implement that in Hungary and Poland and other countries? That's going to be a big question, and I'm not sure there is a lot of consensus there. This being said, regarding regulation and who's going to implement the regulation, I think there are lots of opinions. Eliška, you wrote, I think, quite recently in 2020 in Euroactiv magazine, you wrote an opinion about that, and you said something like, the fight against serious crimes, including child exploitation or terrorist content, cannot be delegated to private actors. Also, I went back a few years and I found a really great piece by Courtney in Columbia Journalism Review, where Courtney, you wrote that the success of misinformation, counterfeit news, and computational propaganda on social media platforms has highlighted economic incentives embedded in social media platforms that not only help fake news flourish, but may even work against quality journalism. You also say that a look at abuse of legal frameworks by authoritarians around the world is a clear warning against government regulation of information. So on the one hand, we do not want the private platforms to regulate that. Others are saying don't let governments anywhere close to these issues. Who's going to do that? Who should do that? And what is your take overall on the issue of regulating these platforms, Kate?
Well, first, I just want to go back to, I don't think that anything I've said presumes that I'm not deeply concerned about state power. I mean, I think both things can be true. That social media companies have too much power, and we need to be very concerned about state power and kind of decenter some of this from overly explicitly a U.S. context in a lot of ways. But state power is a concern here too, of course. And I think maybe the framework of sovereignty can be a useful thing in helping us think about that, because we are kind of stuck in this bipolarity. And I think for a long time, part of the debate was, well, who do we want to regulate the internet? Should it be private companies or should it be in the hands of states? And kind of the answer is neither. I mean, how do we have a human rights framework? How do we have, voices of those of us that use the internet and civil society kind of setting that agenda? So I would just kind of flip that question around, and even the idea of like informational sovereignty that Sandra Brayman writes about, the struggle to the degree over which states have what they might feel is a legitimate right to control kind of information flows, and all the problems that come from when we give states too much power in that space, and our own kind of digital sovereignty in terms of controlling our own kind of digital data. And not to drive that point further home, but I would go to something Cynthia Wong has written about, and reminding us that if Facebook was a country, then in population terms, it would be the world's largest with over 2 billion users. So I think that, and that right now they're being kind of, as she puts it, ruled by a quote, opaque and unaccountable and undemocratic regime in that way. So it kind of cuts both ways, but I just wanted to throw that out. I don't think I've been inconsistent in being concerned on both ways. And again, especially going back to the example with Twitter responding to massive takedowns of content related to the Islamic State. It wasn't that they made their own kind of subjective decision on what should and shouldn't be online at that point. They were responding to pressure from governments, rightly or wrongly, which I guess takes us back full circle to the question Marius is trying to get us to solve, the regulation issue. And I think it's consistent with what I think, we're talking about, how do we distinguish regulation that ensures access to the internet and kind of positive regulation in that way, that and then what do we do about kind of the concerns about giving states power and over concerns about giving states power over content. And I think that that Ethan Zuckerman's done a lot of work on kind of how do we think through the internet as a public interest space, and what kind of ways that if we, again, and I go back to a lot of the early media regulation debates, and in thinking about how public broadcasting was created, as you know, because the recognition was there that we have concentration of power, we have too few actors with too much power, overly controlling flows of information and access to information, and we've got states enabling and kind of benefiting from that in some ways. And in the US, at least, belatedly, after decades of this, in the late 60s and 70s, saying, okay, well, we need a public interest model for broadcasting. And I think we need a public interest model for the internet and how that kind of affects social media. So, because I agree with the discussion we've been having so far about, the things about regulating business models, et cetera, but I wanted to throw that in as well, that I think we can kind of, there's some positive regulation as well in terms of just rethinking the space of these platforms.
Thank you.
Can I pick up on something that Kate said, just related to media regulation? Because one of the reasons that we regulate broadcast, the airwaves, the radio frequencies, is because they're a scarce resource. And the approach was taken, okay, well, the internet is not a scarce resource. But what is a scarce resource today? Attention. So if we think about, regulating because attention is short, then maybe that gets us to things like better oversight and safety guardrails on algorithmic amplification, or kind of the machine learning behind different recommendation approaches. So I think there might be something to think about there. And I also do want to put this into the context of it's the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring, what is now called the Arab Spring. And, so my book, looking at in Egypt, looked at how important the activists there using citizen journalism to bypass restrictions on state media, the limited avenue, any other limited avenues that existed for reporting on police violence, on human rights abuses, on political reform, and how important these digital platforms were for activists to do that, which helped them then imagine a different future being possible, as well as the, connective potential, the ability to organize and all of that. And that, the citizen journalism was very powerful. Egyptians were the first, in Egypt, they were some of the first to use Twitter for human rights advocacy, before, in 2008, when it was like being used to share what you'd had for lunch, right? And then 2008, they started using it to help set the media agenda globally, to connect with reporters globally so that they could influence global media coverage, since they had very limited avenues in country. So I think we also want to think about, how has that ecosystem changed? How can we still enable those sort of movements to leverage the power of the interconnected internet and the anti-censorial nature of that in some of these more closed information regimes, without, adopting these really expansive approaches to, determining what speech can and cannot be used, but also to recognize again that, a lot of these conversations about digital sovereignty are still very state focused. And I'm just gonna, go out there with the fact that, like, the internet was supposed to be something different. The internet was originally conceived of outside of national boundaries. And, just personally, I'm really concerned about digital sovereignty and about this idea that that states should control the information flows and the internet in their boundaries. And I want to see us imagine a world where there is an alternative to state or private company dominance, and where the internet does exist as this space outside of the Westphalian nation state system.
Right, thank you, Courtney. So before going to Eliška, I really want to push you on this issue. Who do you think should have the power regulating these issues, especially because things are happening. And you mentioned a really controversial law that is being discussed in Poland. Hungarian authorities said 2-3 days ago that they are looking into the issue and they want to adopt the law. I'm not even talking about Turkey here, which already adopted a law clamping down on social media last summer in 2020. And every time when I'm thinking about this issue, I'm thinking about who has the power to do that. And I'm always, I'm sharing a few things that I'm looking at these people sometimes when I'm thinking about who should do that. It should be this guy on the left or the guy on the right, this one, that one. This is what we are talking about at the end of the day. We are talking about governments or social media platforms, and social media platforms already are regulating their content internally. They have policies and so on, and now governments are doing that. So, Eliška, do you want to comment on that? Or as Kate said, neither of them. But then, who should actually have the power in deciding about these issues? Eliška?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, now when we started discussing enforcement and who should be the one who actually exercise the oversight, I've just found out that while we are having this discussion, Facebook decided to actually refer the case of suspending Mr. Trump's account to Facebook Oversight Board, which is this new oversight body founded by Facebook, which is supposed to be independent from a platform and decide on certain precedential cases and also issue the recommendations to Facebook on how to handle similar cases in the future. So that's quite interesting development there that has just been announced. So I thought that I will quickly share it with you. But maybe going back to what you mentioned and also the Euroactiv article that you mentioned, and so should it be platform, should it be state, who should have that final word? I think when we discuss the issues of content governance and freedom of expression, of course, that goes directly hand in hand with the state of democracy in those particular countries, as well as how they comply with the rule of law. When you mentioned the article, the Euroactiv opinion, that piece is directly focusing on different piece of EU legislation that we discussed until now, and many of you are familiar with that one if you follow this topic, and that's online terrorist content regulation, or the proposed regulation still, because it's still it will go through the final vote in plenary in the European Parliament probably in spring, and this is exactly the example of how not to do it in our view. That means it's the piece of legislation that still contains, that solely focuses on quick deletion and removal of content. It has not enough, it doesn't contain enough protection for journalistic or artistic content. It still contains 1 hour time frame for content removals, which even last year in France, the short or extremely short time frames for content removals were actually found unconstitutional, which was more in the context of another national legislative proposal, so-called Avia law, that sought to initially tackle only online hate speech, but actually the scope was much broader than that. It's a very problematic piece of legislation that again relies on platforms, purely on platforms, to actually conduct an illegal assessment without any proper judicial oversight. But I think that's an example of how not to regulate platforms, or taking directions that prove to be very harmful from the fundamental rights perspective and for human rights of individual users. Now, who should be responsible? I very much agree with that idea of also focusing on how to actually empower a user and how to return a control to user over information they receive and they impart in the online space, which is another issue we can also tackle. But I think that this is quite a complicated issue due to the fact that an enforcement mechanism will always depend on, to some extent, legal tradition and what can be actually done in that particular legal space. DSA, for instance, envisions these more decentralized form of enforcement at the national level. So it could be several regulators responsible for enforcement of that upcoming regulation. We still need to see what we actually ultimately end up with. But it will be, again, very much in the realm of member states to decide. And that's also due to the competence issues at the EU level. And we often saw in practice, especially with these bad examples of regulation, how these enforcement mechanism is being dumped on media regulators. And now media landscape is very diverse in Europe. You won't find two identical media regulators at the national level. And we still encounter the same issue with the lack of capacity and financial resources for these regulators to actually truly be able to even enforce that new function when it comes to digital platforms. And we saw that in many states. We saw it in the case of Austria, of this recent proposal, and we also saw it in the case of already mentioned Avia law in France. But maybe I would quickly just touch upon the issue of what would be that ideal world that we would like to see. And that's very much the world where users, including underrepresented and vulnerable groups, have the choice, have the possibility to choose from platforms that are maybe more driven with the some community standards that they actually can identify with, where they can feel safe and protected. And that brings us back to the issue of the dominance and how we can actually create that possibility for online space where users can feel empowered. And there are many proposals currently in the space being discussed, such as interoperability, data portability, optimization of algorithms, all these issues that could possibly create not only some normative issues, normative regulations, but actual practical tools for users to be used, and being just able to, you know, take your data, take your information and go to those platforms where the level of protection or the communities that is there actually meets your preferences. And also just to understand why you receive some form of information, and then having that possibility to act upon those information that you receive. So we often say, due to these reasons, we need transparency, but of course, transparency is not enough. It will never be the ultimate solution to this issue. So we need to go a step further beyond that.
Thank you very much. And this is, we don't have much time, but, and I had so many things to ask you, but I want to continue on this idea of the involvement of civil society and how we can influence those debates, because the issues are not actually clear. And even this European law, as you said, is decentralized. Things will be dealt with at national level by regulators, but we know the history of these regulators, how politicized they are and how corrupt many of them are. That's a big problem there. But now when it comes to actually how these things can be influenced, the debates around them, and how you mentioned the rights of users and people, you know, using these platforms. How can we influence these debates? Courtney, you consulted a lot of organizations. Kate, you were part of a big European project with our center researching these issues. What shall we do? Are people's voices, civil society voice, heard in these debates, you think? And what can we do to increase that? Courtney, Kate, any of you? Courtney?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent they're heard. I mean, there are, you know, consultations that some of the big platforms are doing, but again, it's like Facebook and its market size, it's incomparable in terms of, you know, to any other social media platform. So, you know, it held many consultations, this new Facebook oversight board. I think it's an interesting model. I want to see what happens with that. And the fact that they did refer this case and it could have implications and will be binding according to the email I'm trying to read behind the screen, you know, it is an interesting model to look at. But, you know, my personal opinion as an American, like, I kind of like the EU's approach more because it actually has more opportunity for input from civil society. It is a more open process. I'm sure there are many lobbyists in the EU, but there seems to be more visibility into how to input into these consultations than there is here in the United States, where it seems to be that you have to know that some lawmaker is working on a law, or of course, you know, the whole lobbyist dynamic here in the US. So, you know, it does seem like there's some level of greater legitimacy in the EU process in terms of policymaking, but I think it really is incumbent to get the perspective of, you know, we say users, but like we could also think about citizens, but I don't want to exclude the like non-citizens. So I don't know what the right word is, but like the people who are affected, and to make sure that, we're also considering the implications of any sort of regulations and laws beyond the framework in which they are implemented. And again, I think the EU tends to be better at that because it has to be in terms of the way it's doing policymaking. But definitely looking at different forms of regulation at different layers of the stack, focusing government regulation on safety and the public good and interest versus and the business models versus the content, looking at co-regulatory approaches that include civil society, that include user input. But we also cannot expect that users and individuals have the time. So you have to trust that, that democratic governments at least are representing the better interests of society, although I think that's a large level of trust to ask for these days.
Exactly, not so many do that. Kate, the last word is yours.
Pressure. No, I guess I agree and would underscore what Eliška and Courtney were just saying. I would just add, I'm really glad that we're talking about what kind of regulation, not whether there should be regulation, because for a really long time, that's what we were having to bang on about. And I was starting to feel really frustrated with that, right? So this is we've advanced the discussion and the debate around this over the years. And that I think is a good and positive thing. And I don't want to overharp on.
It took us like 10 years, Kate. It took us like 10 years.
Oh, good, only 10? Well, and I think that I don't mean to overly harp on media regulation frameworks, because obviously I get the distinctions. I think it was a really good point that Courtney raised about rethinking scarcity around an attention framework. I think that's a really a thoughtful way of looking at it. And I think that, well, we've already said this, distinguishing infrastructure and content in different ways. But again, just to throw out a couple other things in the US, I mean, we had a fairness doctrine for a while that was a regulatory framework that was trying to address the idea of making sure that there was a plurality of voices, that there was kind of equal time for different issues. We can't get into false equivalencies of around that, but I think it's an important reminder. And concentration of media ownership is a huge, huge problem, and it's a bipartisan problem. It was Bill Clinton in the 1996 Telecommunication Act that has thrown us into, some of the real crises that we're in surrounding journalism and media access. I think the other, and on that, I just want to say the article you brought back with the quote from Wired, Marius, besides from my own kind of allergic reaction and anxiety over seeing quotes of mine, what I actually meant by that was that I think there's an expectation people have that we're not going to pay for things without realizing how we are paying through our data and through our kind of identities in those ways, and that we do need subscription models. We do need to pay more for good and quality content, which is a separate conversation, but I just wanted to throw that out. And I guess the last thing I would say that I'm also, as challenging it is to discuss the kind of Trump and Twitter thing, and it does open up the door for thinking about these issues we've been struggling with on what the limits to platform power, to state power should be, et cetera, that I do think that it's really important that we're also reframing this around the threats of white supremacy. And let's not forget why this whole, why the engagement with his content, and why there were some kind of punitive, if you will, if that's the right word, but actions taken, and that there's a real threat and a real danger. And if we're going to look at this, in terms of harm reduction, it's good that we're reframing that at the same time, also, having the robust debates on protecting freedom of expression.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kate. And I really want to thank you all for making time for this great debate. It was really a pleasure.